Welcome to the Voices of Pueblo podcast, brought to you by the Pueblo Star Journal in Pueblo, Colorado. I'm Gregory Howell, and today we're diving into the stories, inspirations, and innovation shaping our city's vibrant scene. Let's get started. I'm really excited today because this is a continuation of a story that was featured in our March issue titled Gimme Shelter. And it's a very powerful story rooted right here in Pueblo, Colorado, but with regional and national implications, and for that matter, even international. And we'll share more about this amazing story as we move forward. But today I'm with Chantal Woodyard, who is part of the story. And Chantal actually is a consultant with Advantage Advocacy here in Colorado. And I'll let her share a little bit more about how she got into this type of work. And in fact, the story itself is really the reason why she's doing what she does today and providing voice for those who don't have a voice in many of our systems. And the story was written by Molly Cotner, who is one of our writers here at the Pueblo Star Journal. And you can also find her when she's not at the Pueblo Star Journal. She's at CSU Pueblo in the sociology department. And of course, she just received, and we're so excited, her additional master's degree from NYU in journalism. So it's exciting to have you both here. And why don't we start with you, Chantal, just because I started with you in the introductions, and tell us just a little bit about yourself. And then I'm going to have Molly step in and we'll just start unfolding the story.
Thank you for having me, Greg. Today we're going to talk about Advantage Advocacy and Consulting Services, which is my business of 11 years. And I am an international disabilities rights advocate and trainer in civil rights compliance law, specializing in the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a lot of tasks I perform under that umbrella.
And I know you've written for us before, talking about some of the really in Colorado, many of those early, advocacy events that took place in 1970s that really kind of changed the landscape and how we talk about this. And of course, legislation wasn't even there at that time, but it was because of a lot of this advocacy that actually we found legislation and arrived at the American Disabilities Act. So I'll have to pull the date. I can't remember the date of that.
It was actually after the 4th of July weekend in 1978, and Colorado played a huge part in the equal rights and equal opportunities and equal access for people with disabilities. Colorado had the first accessible buses for people with disabilities thanks to the Gang of 19.
Yes, and I love that photograph of the Gang of 19, because if you don't know what you're looking at first, you realize that they got out of their wheelchairs or they got down on the actual street in front of a bus.
Yes, they shut down RTD for 3 days. There's going to be a big commemorative thing being put at Civic Center Park, telling the whole story of Wade Blank and the Gang of 19. I'm really looking forward to that being done.
That's exciting. I just can't imagine, not having any access. It's just extraordinary what they were able to do, and then how that was really drove the legislation that followed.
Yeah.
And Molly, how about you? You arrived at the shores of Pueblo. You've been here for quite some time, and you've just recently joined our team here. And I'm excited because we're already forecasting what we can do in the future for the publication. And summer's just around the corner. I know you teach and you've got summer coming up. So tell me just a little bit about yourself as an entree to this discussion. And then we're just going to get into that first moment when the two of you met, and actually it led to the first story in the March issue.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, definitely summer's coming. So I'm a summer person, so I'm very excited about that. But yeah, I think especially as somebody who does have a background in sociology, specifically Chantal's story, again, that we'll get into, was really important for me because we're talking about a civil rights activist. We're talking about somebody who is fighting for social justice. These are all things that are really near and dear to the things that I like to talk about. I also really want to highlight marginalized voices. And that is what Chantal's expertise is in, right? Is highlighting these individuals and ensuring that they get justice. And that was just so important for, I think, everything that I wanted to talk about and what I initially thought this story was going to be.
Well, and that always unfolds. And oftentimes you kind of have these expectations going into the conversation because you're doing your due diligence, you're doing your research, you're getting the facts, and then you sit down and you talk to the source or sources. And then all of a sudden you're the listener then. And what's amazing is these steps that we take at the Pueblo Star Journal, in fact, for all of the stories that we do, when we're looking at that personality, the storytelling, that authentic and genuine voice, it's not only just the voice, but they're actually present, they're visible, they're actually people that matter. And oftentimes that is sometimes so frustrating. And for those that don't even notice that, well, that's a whole other conversation for another time, because, oftentimes that is the systemic problem. It's a chronic problem, and it's hard to fix those problems sometimes. Yeah, Chantal. Yeah.
That is one of the motivations behind Gimme Shelter, which we'll be talking about. It's a television series that I created over COVID, and that is really one of the key motivations behind creating this story, is to have those marginalized voices heard in a very mainstream way.
Yeah, and it's amazing because it doesn't. I mean, I'm always amazed when I see a new play or a television, program or something that's streaming, and on one of the services. But when you see that, I mean, right now we're seeing that amazing series on Netflix that was shot in 4 takes. And here is a young child who goes, and eventually we find out, it's a spoiler alert, sorry, but that the individual actually does kill this girl. And it's just this adolescence, that is the focus. And it's an amazing, and until I just felt, my heart went out to all of the characters, because these are the big problems that we face as a society. And some of the questions that we ask is, who's to blame? Well, we don't like to blame people, but in the end, you can almost point to anyone, because there's always a role or a responsibility or a failure across all levels of society. So it's almost like we all have to take some responsibility as a society to identify, to understand, and come up with, policies, procedures, best practices, sometimes even vocabulary, because sometimes there isn't even a vocabulary to talk about, some of these issues.
There's a lot of this stuff that was not talked about, and therefore there is not the vocabulary to put some of these stories into words. And so the fact that it's happening, especially with, again, I'm going to use Gimme Shelter,
right,
to do that is, again, really giving those marginalized voices a place to tell their stories.
Yeah, and it's so impactful on so many levels. It's not a heroic part of American history. It was swept under the carpet for so long because it's shameful. Yeah.
Not the people, but what happened to the people and the way that we treated them. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in our news again today. We're seeing the marginalization of people and atrocities happen that you didn't think would ever come back.
No, and it's interesting because there seems to be a tendency now, and I think COVID really made it even worse because we were isolated, and for some reason everything becomes the other. So it's really easy to lay blame or find fault or to just not even discuss it, but then show that it's the other. And I'm with this group over here. It's a real problem in our society because, we've always disagreed about a lot of things, but we were able to get things done in a very kind of messy way. But that's kind of how the system kind of works. But now, it's almost like we've been here before, people.
Which is why it's important that we tell this story.
Yes.
And we tell the history of what really happened during the disability rights movement, the things that the public really aren't aware of or they haven't thought of. And hopefully in shining the light on that, moving forward, might change their mind about certain things that are happening in today's.
And I know the Pueblo Star Journal has made a commitment to reporting on not just this story. We're going to continue because by the end of this episode, you're going to want to wait for number 2 and number 3, because there's a lot coming down the line that we don't know yet. And we'll get into that in a moment with our discussion. But if you're just joining us, I'm Gregory Howell, and I'm with Chantal Woodyard, and I'm also with Molly Cotner. And we're talking about Gimme Shelter. This was an article that was written and published on the cover of our March issue. And I'd like to kind of transition the discussion, because I understand when I introduced the two of you, that first point of contact led to this amazing, like timeless, but I guess it was 5-hour discussion about this subject matter. So tell me about that.
Yeah. Originally, Gimme Shelter was having a live reading in December, and I was supposed to go to that.
I went to that, and it was amazing. It was amazing.
Did. And I happened to come down with COVID at the time. So I was really sick, and it was kind of a circle back moment. March was coming up. There is a lot of disability awareness type events in March. And this also had kind of a personal angle for me. I have a sister with Down syndrome, and March is a big month for Down syndrome awareness. And so it kind of fit. And I think that really originally, I mean, if we want to think about it, I kind of just went in to the story very superficially. It was this idea of, I'm going to talk to this disability rights like activist and knowledge and expert, and really just kind of shine a light on this awareness and those kind of things. And so, I mean, I always want to ask you what it was like, because I just text Chantal out of the blue. Hey, hi, you remember me? Yeah. And would you be willing to let me just sit down and talk with you? And I think I would love to hear what that was like for Chantal to hear that. But when that happened and she agreed, there was this unfolding. And before we get to that, I want to know, I've always wondered what that reaction was kind of on my end. But I think there was something that unfolded so beautifully that it was just kind of indescribable about how that went. Yeah. But yeah, what was that like?
And those are the stories we need to tell, Absolutely. The ones that happen that way.
So when I got the text message, Molly, and I'm used to people reaching out to me for my ADA expertise. So I was very much thinking in that vein of, yeah, I can go down and tell Molly about the ADA and the history of the disability rights movement. And, that's not going to be, I could, almost,
you've done that, been there. It's like you can look it up on the internet.
Pilot, yes. Right, yeah. Google me. But when I got down there, I'll admit I was really in a place of worry and concern for the people that I serve, because of all of the big the shock and awe that was happening within the government, and I wasn't sure. And I was feeling kind of tired, as an advocate.
Welcome to the crowd.
Right. And so I had just kind of gone through this, like, I can't, I've got to keep putting this word out here. So that was really my frame of mind when I went down to talk to Molly about how important this is now, and how, we need to remember the history of the disability rights. So I was not at all intending to get into my backstory and how I got into disability rights on the level that we did. But I'll tell you, it was so easy. Like, Molly and I just connected on a level that I don't think either one of us were expecting. And it was just, she asked the questions and I told her what happened. I mean, and before we knew it, it was 5 hours later.
And it reads that way too, when you read something. And I think sometimes, and it's so important, and I'm so glad that we were able, at least for you two, to come to that place, that safe place, where you were able to tell that story, because that's been the problem for so long, is it's such a hard, difficult, and messy story. And most people, you've got shame, you've got all those other things mixed in that bundle, and they never really come out in an authentic and genuine way. And we oftentimes are pointing victimization, we're doing all these weird things in response, which really aren't helpful. when we're really trying to deal with the problem. And it gets sensationalized. You can see it in so many different genres. But here was an opportunity, because I remember, Chantal, when you told me when you found the journal, which I'll let you guys talk about, but I remember it was like you had walked through a door, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, this is me. This is my story. These are my voices written here. So I'm going to let you continue and tell us more about that 5-hour journey, because it clearly was that spark that enabled the story to evolve in a way that we at the Pueblo Star Journal love, because it is about those kind of voices. And that's why this podcast is called Voices of Pueblo. It really is, a vehicle for us to take these stories and put real people. They're real people behind the written word and those lines. But here we are in this podcast. And soon, of course, later this year, we'll actually be getting into video broadcast, 2 and 5 minute news segments, which will further enhance, because sadly, a lot of people just don't like to read anymore, which is really, it bothers me, but we need to meet people where they are. And many people really have crossed the digital divide, and they're in that realm where that's where they get their news and information. So we're gonna go there, but we need to find the balancing. But no matter where we are, it's still rooted in that original, authentic, and genuine story, which is what we're talking about now. Absolutely.
I mean, when we first met, it very much was just kind of quickly, hi. I remember Chantal was dressed so beautifully. And I remember thinking, I was just in like jeans and a t-shirt. I was just there, and she was dressed so business. And I remember thinking, this is like how she's dressed right now is so important. And I think I brought that into
it's in the article. We have a picture in the article too.
It was just because it was so important. She was just dressed so beautifully and so much like the expert. And as you mentioned, it was just this moment. It started with this kind of talk of, this is what I'm trying to get at, but I'd love to know a little bit more about you. And in that moment, she kind of said, I'm tired. And I remember, like, what does that look like, as an advocate right now? And she said to me, last week, I was curled up in a corner, crying my eyes out because I didn't know how to help the people I'm supposed to help. And
I'd be tired. That's exhausting. Chills. I mean, emotional.
Absolutely. Chills. And I was looking at her, and she said, I just genuinely didn't know what to do. And then I realized she said to me, I don't have time to do this, But
isn't that nice that someone is honest and in your face?
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, how nice that is. Well, as hard as that is to be a part of that situation, it's just so refreshing, even though that's the hardest thing to deal with. But you know where you are. You know what you need to do. You know what the next sentence is going to be.
And I knew in that moment, first of all, I was like, oh, I think this lady is somebody I like. And I think we need to caveat with the fact that I had never met Chantal before. So
I'd talked about her.
You had talked about her. Yeah. I had known that she was on the board, but we had never had contact with one another. And so did not know each other's backgrounds, did not know where we stood. And it was that moment for me, I think, that switched it in my head that said, this story now has changed.
And that's where it becomes universal, in the sense that this is bigger than Pueblo. It's bigger than Colorado. It's bigger than the United States. I mean, it's a human interest story that rises to the occasion of the highest level of just honoring humanity.
Well, and I can say lightning has crashed several times in this process, and meeting Molly and doing the article was definitely one of those moments. Winding back in the storytelling of Gimme Shelter, probably one of the first moments of lightning crashing for me is when I was digging around in my family home in the basement of what's called the Gimme Shelter house. It was my grandparents' home. They moved in 47, bought it in 1950, and they just happened to be neighbors with another Pueblo family, the Stanifers. And Jack Stanifer, which was one of the sons of the Stanifer, of Margaret and Glenn, who lived next door to my grandparents, They also had 6 boys, and you probably, if you're listening to this podcast in Pueblo, you probably know one of them or their children.
And Campbell's Nursery. I mean, you know their
Nursery.
business.
Yes. We're very best friends with my father and my Uncle Ron, and both are key characters in the series, as well as Jack Stanifer. Now, again,
Tell me about Jack, because Jack's amazing. I've heard this story.
And you talk about lightning crashing. I mean, so every little bit of this story that led me to do what I did are those little moments, right? Those little human moments. And I met Jack. I grew up never not knowing Jack. And as I grew up in the 70s, there was a television series out called The $6 Million Man.
Yes,
and
filmed it in my neighborhood in California.
I thought he was better than The $6 Million Man.
Wow.
Because he was living in an inaccessible world with all of the high-tech accessible stuff of the day. Like, he had a motorized chair that he would ride me around the block on his lap on. Only there were no sidewalks. We'd have to go on the road. And so those are some of the things that we've made some really good scenes out of that's in the pilot episode of Gimme Shelter. But I don't know if I would have thought differently if Jack Stanifer hadn't lived next to us and been best friends with my family, right? So, and that all happened in North Pueblo on West Street. So this story that's going to have universal, I do believe universal lightning crashing moments for everybody here, right? Because let's face it, as we were talking earlier, 1 in 4 people have somebody they know or have a disability. And the other subject that we're dealing with in this series is child abuse and abuse. And I think that statistic is pretty much the same for people who have someone that they know or someone has experienced abuse. So that's why this is a universal story. And to be fair, this isn't all. This whole story isn't heavy. There's like Jack Stanifer is a great light, and I have loved helping create his character with the blessing of his family and
his family still.
Yes.
I mean, they talk about him like he is still present.
He is,
but he's
yes.
been. When did he pass?
He actually passed in 1984, 6 years before we had the Americans with Disabilities Act. So he lived and worked and thrived. He drove a vehicle, lived independently because his family chose for him to live independently.
Right. That was a big part of it.
They told him, let's institutionalize him in 1965 when the accident happened, and he became paralyzed, and his family said, no way. And that is when we started to see some significant changes in our country and how we looked at people with disabilities. But Gimme Shelter is the story of that struggle.
And I wanted to mention just one thing, too, on these 1 in 4. I mean, those are only the people that we know.
Right.
So think about all the people, because this is a story, this is a situation, this is a really complex issue that people just don't want to talk about. They don't want to share it or express what they're. So those numbers, are on the low side versus the high side,
or they don't want to acknowledge it.
Exactly.
If you would have asked my 95-year-old grandma who lived in the Woodyards and West Street house, if she was a person with a disability, she would have said, nah, I'm not. She was deaf in her left ear from 14 years old.
Wow.
So
she adapted to that, and then didn't want to admit it either.
Right, exactly. Yep. So there was also the Scarlet D. You don't want to acknowledge that you're a person with a disability. I still go through that with some of the students that I teach self-advocacy for students to, and then when I tell them the history of what people went through to be able to have this conversation with them, sometimes they change their mind because it's not so shameful. And that's the other thing I want Gimme Shelter to do is to take away the stigma, take away that shame, and be able to ask for those accommodations and modifications that people fought for them to have.
Yeah. I mean, it's...
And to tell that story. So a lightning crashed when I was rooting around in the basement of my family home that I have inherited, and I found a diary that I kept when I was on the run and in hiding with my mother from the Maine authorities in 1985 when I was 15 years old. That was 40 years ago right now, by the way.
Do you remember putting those in the basement? Or, I mean, because I remember you calling me and saying, you're not going to believe what I found. And it was almost like you were meeting yourself, in those journals. I mean, was that a person you knew? Or, I mean, when did you realize that this...
I actually had put it in the basement. So in the 90s, I used to write a bunch of song lyrics. And I had recently had somebody sit next to me with a guitar, and I'm like, I used to write all these song lyrics. I'm going to go find this in my basement. Oh. So I went down there, and looking for those song lyrics, I find this diary. And I'm like, at first I was like, what is this? And I opened it, and I was like, oh my gosh. And literally the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I got chills, and I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this, but I have to do something with this. Totally forgot about the song lyrics. and brought this up, and it sat on my table for 3 months.
Wow.
And then COVID hit. And I had...
What a calling right there. I mean, as horrible as COVID was, man, I
had the time to develop it right before COVID hit, though, as I was again, wondering what am I going to do with this? And
did you feel that you needed to? I mean, it sounds like there was a calling that you needed to do it was just screaming at you that you need to do something with it.
And it wouldn't leave me alone.
Oh, gosh.
Like, it was like I kept trying to push it down. I had so much going on. And, I was just pushing it to the back of my head. And then, of course, the content I was also pushing to the back of my head.
Sure.
Bringing that up again. And then... but then it started again. It just started to work on me. And I thought, you know what? I need to go back to Wyoming. I need to go back to the place where my mother, as a recreational aide, moved me to in 1974 to the Wyoming, where she worked at the Wyoming State Hospital, where I did develop my first real sense of injustice and how we treated people with disabilities. Because on one hand, I'd grown up with Jack Stanifer being this neighbor. And then all of a sudden, I am in the underground tunnels of the Wyoming State Hospital.
And I think that's why we put those images at the start of your story, because I remember you sharing those with me.
Yes. And so I got, I was very relentless in trying to get access and to get back down there. And when I was available, when I was granted that, I literally drove from Pueblo to Wyoming in between snowstorms. It was right before Thanksgiving, and was able to reconnect with that part of my story, which I had not done. And so I was really, and so when I was in the tunnels and I was seeing the places that I had grown up and remembering the stuff and the people there, that's when lightning crashed again.
Wow.
And I said, that's how I'm using my story to tell their stories. And then COVID hit. And I had all of that time to develop the idea.
Well, what was that drive like? You finally get permission. It's winter. You're in your car, and that's like wide open spaces. I mean, what was going on in your head before you got to Wyoming?
I can tell you this. So we would come back to Colorado to the Gimme Shelter house in the summer, my sister and I, to go visit our dad. And that was my reprieve away from my violent home life in Wyoming with my mom and my stepdad. And so I would so look forward to those summers. They were just like that 6 weeks that I had the freedom. And the drive back, that's all I need to say.
Oh, my God. I didn't even think of that.
So
but that, oh, my gosh.
As I am purposely driving myself there.
Intentionally.
That's
oh, my
going
gosh.
through my head was those memories. And those, like, sometimes we would we would come back and we'd be completely moved. Like, we would just, all of my stuff would be gone. I would know, I'd have a whole new room, a whole new place to live without being told. Sometimes I'd come back and I'd be having another sibling in a few months. So you never knew what I was coming home to. And so those are the things that went through my head as I was going to Evanston, back to Evanston for the first time.
So that was a real calling then when you realized you needed to go back to Wyoming, to that state hospital.
Absolutely.
That was really that was the loudest voice in your head.
It wouldn't let me go.
Oh, wow.
I had to do it. And again, given the way that I did it, and I'm glad I didn't give myself a lot of time to think about it.
No, it sounds like you just jumped in that car and went.
And I will say, I came back and I was so excited because I knew what I had when that lightning crashed. I knew at that point I just had to make it make sense. And it took me 5 years to do that.
Right. But I think with that clarity, it enabled you, because there's a lot of faces that up until then, I mean, you had the journal, now there were faces with names and stories. And so it gave you the ability to actually navigate. Even though it took 5 years, you needed to have that clarity of purpose. And here was your purpose.
This. Yes, absolutely.
Wow. And Molly, you were there during that initial, in the same house where she found the journal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that this, if you want to know like what our conversation looked like, it was this, was the conversation of what were you doing when you're standing in the same room that, of course, trigger warning, but that you were sexually abused in.
Yeah.
Like what does that look like? And again, lightning crashing.
Yes.
She opens up, to me, and she tells me that this is this is what's going through my head, which was, I think we talked heavily about this. I said, I don't know where to start this story. Yeah. I said, do I start with you on the ground, saying I got to get back to work? Do I start with you in those tunnels? Do I start with the fact that she has this photo and it is in our story of this surgical table.
Yes.
With a light coming in and this conversation of like, what does that look like? And then how do you connect that with being on the run and having this stuff, and then walking through that as an outsider, walking through that and having, just so many kudos to you because you walked through this, and it's a convoluted story.
Yeah.
Like this is not it's not linear. Chantal's story is not a linear story of here's where it started, here's like a clean middle and clean end, like this arc, that we're so used to.
We're still in it.
Absolutely.
Given my abuser just died, and we have, I just got his obituary today.
Wow.
So it's still, the story of the story is still moving on. And then SeriesFest and all of the excitement that we have there.
One thing that I did notice that I picked up on, which I didn't before, is, and you're just talking about how this is not linear, but it sounds like you were able, in this messy, complex, convoluted situation, that you found for yourself safe moments or places like this drive, 6 weeks, summer in Pueblo, was one of those things you put in your head that gave you, because I've talked to other people who have in their mind created these safe spaces while they know they're still going to be going back to an abusive situation. It sounds like clearly not linear, but you had found, that is what's so powerful about the story, is you within yourself found the power and the strength to actually move forward, even though it's not linear. You're just all over the place.
I don't know how to describe it. I am, and I'm going to bring it back to Pueblo because those summers in Pueblo, and I didn't realize, we're my safe place. That's where I got, I think, a lot of development that I would have really missed out on if I did not have that reprieve and have that safe spot in the Gimme Shelter house.
Yeah.
But also, I didn't realize as an adult how badly I wanted to get back here. Like, I thought when we were on the run, we were coming to Pueblo, and when we didn't, I was so upset, so upset. And then of course in the story in the paper, you see, I end up being sent to my dad's in Oklahoma, but this is my dad's paternal home.
Right.
So when I brought my family back here in 2002 to help be near my elderly grandparents before they passed away, and we came back from Flagstaff. I had 2 daughters and my ex-husband now. I remember standing on the edge of the Arkansas River and just feeling like a piece of the puzzle had been put back. I'm home.
That's amazing. I mean, when you think about just the power of memory and the power of place, I mean, and of course, that's why people are here in Pueblo. You can go back 10,000 years when you talk about the water, you talk about the Arkansas. Well, I mean, there's just safety there.
And you talk about advantage advocacy, the business that I've had for 11 years. If I had not had my family home that I inherited, I don't know that I ever would have started that business and that I ever would have had the security or the safety to think that I could do that. And it was because of the Gimme Shelter house and that stability that I came back to, because it actually had sat empty for 2 years after my grandma passed away. And so, we obviously kept the house, but when I came back and took that place over and started my business, that Gimme Shelter house has been helping give shelter to a lot of other people. One of the things that I do with Advantage Advocacy is I help people get and keep jobs and be as independent as they can be. And that probably wouldn't have happened either without the Gimme Shelter house.
And that says a lot about a very powerful 4-letter word, home, H-O-M-E. Because home can be anywhere. You know, home is a physical place. It's also a place in your mind. It's an emotional place. But our readers may be one, because I know you mentioned it, but you've mentioned Pueblo, you've mentioned Wyoming, you've mentioned Flagstaff, you've mentioned Maine. So how do all of those places, I'm just thinking of it from a geographical standpoint, and you talk about this return to home, this 6 weeks in the summertime, which we all love summer. I mean, it's school's out, but here you are, you have a heightened awareness of your own existential kind of being. That was your safety net, which of course, now it's so clear and obvious why. I mean, it just goes right to your soul, to your heart. You know, when you're standing on the edge of the Arkansas and you realize you're in the right place now. Yeah. But we'll talk about Maine. I know you've mentioned Maine. What is the Maine connection?
Okay, so, and this is part of the scandalous story. So again, my mother and my stepdad moved us around a lot, and we were always leaving a place in a cloud of scandal. And you would think, my stepdad was actually a prominent person. He was my mother's boss at the state hospital. He had lost his job there. He had actually been tried and acquitted in Wyoming for child abuse. And at that point, I thought he was going to get away with it forever. He was untouchable. And at that point, I was in 8th grade, being homeschooled. And after that, he had applied for a job in literally the far reaches of the world. As far away you get besides Alaska, I think, was Caribou, Maine. Is where he got a job.
Oh my God.
And so one summer I go to visit, and my dad my dad lived in Oklahoma, so I came to Colorado, went to Oklahoma. He put me on a plane to Maine, and that was the summer before my freshman year.
What was going through your mind? You're getting on this plane to go to Maine.
At 14 by myself. So very much free-range parenting back then. And I remember my dad giving me a credit card going, you have a really tight connection in Boston, so if you have to get a room here. I'm like, oh, okay.
Well, thank you, Dad.
Okay. I didn't know what to expect. I'd never been to Maine. I'd never been to the East Coast.
If you've never been, I mean, what do you know about Maine? It just points right there in the top northeast.
And I guess I was a little excited because, I had friends that I couldn't have anymore once Stuart was arrested in Wyoming, which has been really the great thing about Facebook and stuff, because I've been able to reconnect with those friends.
Wow.
And over the years, which has been really helpful in me putting together this story and going back in time. But that's how we landed in Maine. We were only in Maine a year and a half before the Maine authorities started questioning me. Like, I think that there was just some kind of conference or something.
How did this happen? How did they start questioning you?
I missed the bus, and I was 15. I missed the bus, and I was scared out of my head because...
And what bus are you talking? Is this like a city?
School bus.
School bus. Okay, okay.
And we lived 20 miles out
of
town.
That's, you're rural America, yeah.
Yeah, and we were literally like miles away from the Canadian border. That's how far up there we were. very isolated, which surprised me because it was the state of Maine that arrested him and convicted him finally, and that's where that happened. But it was I think in 1984. There was a lot more awareness, and they were doing conferences of how to spot abuse. And now that I think back to the way I was questioned, I do believe that's something that happened, and that's where they got the information. And then they actually questioned one of my sisters with a social worker, a younger sister.
How were they just seeing you standing there? How did they find you?
They had to call him. Because they had to call him because we missed the bus and he was supposed to come pick us up, and my sister and I were freaking
I just
out.
see these cops just arriving at a bus stop. I'm just
and so it wasn't, and then the police didn't come. They arrested him. He had gotten the head of occupational therapy at the Cary Medical Center, so he was a prominent person in town.
Wow.
And they arrested him on the job because of what the social workers revealed with my little sister at the time, and so. He was tried and convicted in the state of Maine, but before that was, in 2025, my mother would have been arrested too. In 1984, she wasn't. She chose the children over him, but she was still meeting him in town. And she was very angry with me for turning him in and upsetting things. And it wasn't the typical mother response that you would think if your child came to you with this information. And she had heard through channels in town, because the town was divided on who was telling the truth, and she had heard that they were going to come either take us and take her too, or just take us, the state. And she came in one morning and she said, "Pack, we're leaving." And we loaded up, and and my stepdad wasn't with us, but his family friends hid us out in Michigan with the Seventh-day Adventists there.
So you're now on your way to Maine.
Yeah. Well, we were.
On your way to Michigan.
Michigan, right?
I'm just still trying to process it.
Via
I haven't left
Canada.
Maine yet.
Via Canada. So this is the diary, though, that I found when I was digging around in the basement. Was when I was on the run and in hiding from the Maine authorities. My dad, Mr. Wayne Woodyard, is a retired capital criminal defense attorney from the state of Oklahoma, but he started out in the prosecution's office as a district attorney. And my Uncle Ronnie, who's deceased now, very good friends with Gary Stanifer up into the end. And Ronnie's actually a pivotal character in later episodes in Gimme Shelter, was a DEA agent. So they found me. There were no Amber Alerts, but I had a social worker walk into classroom using my real name, and I knew that Daddy found me, and I knew that I was on my way to Oklahoma.
And that's a whole story within a story.
Right.
When you think about what was going on, unbeknownst to a certain extent by you, because you kind of knew that there was something going on. And of course, you see actions being taken by the police there on the request of these other authorities in other jurisdictions. But then all of a sudden your mother gets wind of it, and then you're on the run again. So, do you know that? Have you been able to kind of share the whole backstory of that with your dad and your uncle? That's amazing. That's like another series in its own right.
It is. Unfortunately, part of Uncle Ronnie's story is pretty sad, and he's no longer here. But just recently, Daddy's been getting some of these details. I landed there, and then I was safe, and life was different, and we didn't talk about it. I had some counseling, but I literally I went from helping, take care of my siblings to being the only child. My stepmom was the assistant superintendent of schools in a small town. It was just such a different life, and I wasn't that weird kid who's with the weird religion, whose family's weird. I was Wayne and Nancy's daughter. And that was, and just embraced by, again, I spent summers here, so I knew kids and stuff. But it really helped me to shape, to be able to do this. I think if I hadn't had that time, I don't know that I could be here, turning over these rocks today.
Well, you actually found your place. You actually had a place. This place, wants you, and you want this place. So it's really powerful when you realize that you're built into the whole, kind of system, and with it, whether it's family, whether it's church, whether it's business, and whatever, education.
And I was dropped in it, in a way, it was almost like one of those romance novels, or when you were young,
I don't know how romantic that is, but I get where you're going with the storyline.
Right. Like, like this Cinderella story, if you will, right? From, and nobody, it's really funny when I was redoing this. Of course, I'm still really good friends with my friends from Pahuska and high school. And none of them, like 2 of my friends knew something was up, but none of them knew I had come from being on the run. And
see, Molly, I know you were thinking about this.
Well, yeah, because I want to even preface with the idea that this is happening.
Right. I mean,
then her mother does come back to Pueblo.
Yes.
And there is a news story.
Yes.
Printed.
Yes.
In a prominent newspaper.
Yes, the chieftain actually. Steve Henson was actually the writer of that story.
It is full of inaccuracies.
Well,
right? In the sense of really understanding the trajectory of what actually was happening. It was very much through the lens of her mom.
Yeah. Well,
right? As a victim.
And I would love to, as our responsibility as the Pueblo Star Journal, because we don't know really all the details surrounding that interview that the chieftain did.
We do not, yeah.
And Steve, we have one of his pieces that we did recently. I think that would be a really interesting project for us to look at that original article that Steve wrote. I mean, I don't know what the motivations were, the intentions were. I don't know the backstory of that. But I think knowing how this story has evolved some 40 years, more than 40 years later, here we are. And this is a perfect segue, because what's really exciting is the screenplay that, and we mentioned this earlier in the podcast, that you had some readings, which I attended, which were amazing. And it was the first time where the embodiment of the story was in all of these characters, that all of a sudden your story became alive. So what I'm really excited to announce, and I'll let you announce it because now there are press releases, but Gimme Shelter has been chosen. And I'll let you give all the details because it's so exciting, because SeriesFest is one of the most competitive series competitions in the world.
Over 10,000
submissions. And you were one of 5.
That are pitching to the networks on May 1st. And I have such a great team with Chris Crazy Legs Fonseca, the comedian. He's going to be here performing on April 26th, by the way. I'm going to plug his show
put that on
here.
My calendar.
And then Peter Trin, who has been the co-writer, co-creator.
Amazing.
He is
God, he did
awesome.
A fantastic job
he really
taking your story and making it work for that format.
He made it flow. He added like the parts that he added about Jack's character, Bobby. And really, I mean, he went the extra mile interviewing the Stanifers, Mike and Gary and Pat all participated in the interviews. And
did he also
came to the reading as well?
Did he add the dates on the screens? I thought when I watched your performance,
him and Tony,
that was the most
our director,
thing, because
it helps keep it flowing, because
and you can go back and forth, and you have the reference, you have the context, and you go back and forth. But that was so helpful, because this Gimme Shelter, that reading in particular, not only was an affirmation of your story and a story that needs to be told, but the movement, the American disability, that whole movement, it put it all into context. And how, yes, in some ways we've made great progress, but in other ways, it's like we're freaking back in the 1800s.
Well, and I fear we're going backwards, right? I mean, our state isn't, thank goodness, our state is passing laws to make sure that people with disabilities still have their rights and still get services, much needed services, to keep them independent and not institutionalized, which is again why it is so important that people know the history of this particular movement. It's different than the other minority right movements, in that we've already mentioned anybody can become a person with a disability at any time. It's non-exclusive. Right. And even if we aren't or don't consider ourselves people with disabilities, we definitely know someone, have someone in our family that has been affected by a disability one way or the other. And that's not left or right. That's not politics. That's just what is.
Can I add that also I think that this story is about community. And I think that that is something that has always stuck out to me about this story, that this is a story about an individual. It is about people. It is about a community. It's about somebody fighting within and outside of that community, but it is also part of the Pueblo community. After this story came out, I had the privilege of being able to see the Gimme Shelter house and being able to engage in Chantal with the Stanifers. And one of the most beautiful things that I saw out of that, you know, sometimes we sit back, particularly as journalists, but also sociologists and stuff, and I watched them. And I watched how they connected with one another. And the story, we were sitting on the front porch of the Gimme Shelter house with your dad, with the brothers, right? And we were sitting there, and they were telling stories of all of these beautiful things about Jack, about their connection to your dad, about the crazy things that they would do when they were teenagers and lighting off fireworks in the front yard. And so this is such the story. And I think what's the beautiful thing about SeriesFest and what's coming up with SeriesFest is that this story transcends so many different areas. It's not just, again, a linear story. And I think it's why it made it so difficult to write. It's why it's created in such a unique way, because it's about an individual. It's about the state. It's about marginalized people. It's about Pueblo. And that's what's so deliberate about it. It's why there's like this emotion behind it. You can't help but engage in this story and feel something.
Right. Well, I think what you just said about the Arkansas River, I mean, that is so symbolic on so many different levels. And I know we've had an article recently by Helen Dunn who wants to build the memorial. It's called the Remembering Memorial, and it's about memory and remembering ancestors and those before us and identifying land and honoring land. I mean, there's so many different things that our memory, I mean, it's one of the most powerful things that, like your journey, again, nonlinear. I mean, you can just see how your memory took you on a wild chase.
Definitely.
I mean, for decades. But having that knowledge, having that experience, having been you were so just resilient, you know, in so many different situations that it actually gave you the skill set, the ability, I mean, especially doing advocacy work, because you've been there, you've done that, you've experienced it, and you've been on the front line. So I'm sure when you're working with people, it's still just tough as nails to get, you know, people back into, you know, their local community, into the workforce, you know, into a safe situation. But you've been there, you've done it, you know what that's like.
And I can tell you, actually, Peter and I were just talking about this as we were having a pitch practice for the SeriesFest, about how it's those experiences, those childhood experiences that has made me be so intuitive and be able to connect on a level that not everybody can with someone who maybe can't communicate the way that we all do. And I think that is what has helped me help them be successful, and that is the whole reason behind this. You know?
Well, and that's such a beautiful thing too, because now we have so many, and I've worked as an art adjudicator. I have to meet with students that are nonverbal. They're brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant, but they're nonverbal. And what does that mean? I mean, you talk about communication. I mean, that's a whole other level of getting to that place.
We're going to meet some really neat characters in Gimme Shelter that help really explain and help people to communicate with nonverbal people.
And I love this part of it. Molly, why don't you kind of wrap up this, because we're going to have some updates and more information in the May issue coming up. But I have some information for our listeners and for our readers. But I know, you know, this was such a passion project for you, and it's so exciting just to see how it's kind of evolved. And then unbeknownst to us, your screenplay, gets chosen out of just 10,000 plus.
On my birthday.
That's exciting.
Well, and can I just add 40 years ago right now, and it will be 40 years ago then, I was turning 16 on the run, and I could have never fathomed that I would be sitting here today telling everybody that.
That's story. The last thing you probably were thinking. You were thinking, oh my God.
Right. I have to tell you, I think that this is the beauty of what we've done here with PSJ and like deliberative journalism and having Chantal as, part of our board and having this story be told, because I think that this is, there was a connection made that I don't think many journalists are able to do. And that is that there was this relationship that was formed between Chantal and I that will, I believe, connect us forever. I mean, the amount of tears that we have shed together. I got the news that the monster in her story passed away from her. And I cannot tell you how I cried as if it were my own accomplishment, right? And so thinking about, we have shed so many tears. The amount of crying that we have done together, but I think that's a testament to the beauty of this human that's sitting here with us, right? And the ways in which she engages. And I think that's what makes Gimme Shelter like so unique, because it is not cookie cutter. And it's not from a box, and it's not generated from something else. It's messy, and it's icky, and it is heartbreaking, and there are times you want to vomit.
But that's where all the best stories are. That's where humanity is.
There is this humanness and this intrigue and this resilience and resistance and revolution that is built into all of this. And man, if I do not think from a personal perspective, but also as an educator, if we do not need that more than ever right now.
That's right. No. And I think on that note, I'm so excited because what you've just been listening to is a conversation between Chantal Woodyard and Molly Cotner. They are the two, one the source, one the writer, and they were featured in the March issue of the Pueblo Star Journal titled Gimme Shelter. And just those two words, gimme shelter. Think about just the power of those two words. Not knowing anything, it's so universal because there are certain basic human rights that we have as individuals. And here you have to start with that because it's both literally a place, but it's also in your mind, it's in your body, it's in your soul. So I do want to mention in the article that some names in the article, Gimme Shelter, have been changed to protect the privacy of individuals due to the sensitive nature of the subject matter. These changes align with those provided with permission from Chantal Woodyard in the Gimme Shelter TV series. Beyond these alterations, all events and accounts have been thoroughly investigated and are presented as truthful and accurate to the best of our knowledge. If you or someone you know has experienced abuse or sexual violence, you are not alone. Help is available. Please reach out to local support services, hotlines, or trusted individuals who can provide assistance and guidance. 1. Child Abuse Reporting 719-583-6901. Adult Protective Services 719-583-6160. The Rape Crisis Hotline 719-549-0549. The Center for Self-Reliance 719-546-1271. And with that, we're going to be wrapping up this episode of the Voices of Pueblo podcast from the Pueblo Star Journal. Thanks for listening and celebrating the creativity and humanity that makes Pueblo shine. For more stories and updates, visit pueblostarjournal.org. And don't forget, you can find our podcast on all major platforms, including iTunes, YouTube Music, and Spotify. Subscribe, follow, and keep listening. And stay tuned for the May issue because there we'll have a great follow-up to Gimme Shelter. Thanks again to Chantal Woodyard and Molly Cotner.